century.
This is George Lucas. I'm the director and writer of THX 1138.
And this is Walter Murch. I collaborated on the screenplay of THX 1138 with George and also did the sound design on the film.
I wanted to put this Old Republic serial on the head of the film because it has a certain kind of definition about hero. And the film is about a hero. The film is about a hero that lives in an anthill and dares to go outside, to do something different, to move away from the status quo. And the thing I liked about this trailer the most was that they describe Buck Rogers as an ordinary fellow, a regular person like anybody else that doesn't really do anything that special, except he just doesn't keeps his wits about him. And I thought that was a perfect description of what this main character THX is and what he does. Is he does a very small thing, which is to move out of his environment, but it's a very heroic thing and a very kind of thing that we used to relate to in comic books and Saturday afternoon serials.
Although you don't know it yet, the world of THX takes place underground. And so when we were designing the titles and thinking about how they might go, we decided to run them in the opposite direction from the way they normally run. So I think this is the only case in film history of titles that go from the top of the screen down to the bottom. George had taken a story sketch written by Matthew Robbins at film school, which was 1¼ pages long, but the essence was a man escaping from an underground society that was heavily reliant on video monitoring and escaped up to the surface of the earth. The revelation at the end of the sketch was that, in fact, this was an underground society. George shot a expanded version of this in film school, which won a number of prizes, and that became the launching pad to make a feature motion picture out of it.
And in expanding it, I wanted to try to make a film that was a little bit more accessible to an audience, but at the same time, I really was very much in the world of abstract filmmaking and visual filmmaking. It was meant to be a very stylized film, very two-dimensional, very little camera movement. It was designed really to be an experience, a metaphor about the way we lived in the early 60s, about consumerism, about conformity, disintegration of emotions, about trying to make everything perfect in a way that was nightmarish.
What's wrong?
Never mind.
These series of disconnected images at the beginning of the film have a deliberately disorienting effect, although once you've seen the film, you see how some of them connect up to the main part of the story. What we were interested in doing was making a film from the future rather than about the future, so that it's as if you were looking at a film from a foreign country whose customs and habits and cinematic language you were really not familiar with. But that's kind of fascinating. If you see a film from Japan made for a Japanese audience, there are just certain cultural things about it that make it unique. We were trying to do that, except this was a film from the country of the future, and so there are just assumptions that wouldn't be understandable by a present-day audience. This naturally made for a little confusion in the audience that did see it, but that was actually, to a certain extent, part of our intent.
All right, then just back off, THX 1138. Back off for a second. Okay, hold it, 1138. Hold.
What's wrong?
I need something stronger.
Take 4 red capsules. In 10 minutes, take 2 more. Help is on the way.
What's wrong?
I want you to take a visual record of this. We found it in the patching cells. We killed it.
The film is meant on a lot of different levels as a metaphor, and there's lots of symbolism of our hero actually building robots, being very godlike in nature, creating men, the men who ultimately chase him, and who are the authority figures in this society. But it's a society that's dedicated to being clean and organized and getting rid of all the messiness of the world. The approach of this film was to create a visual experience and a sound experience that was more atmospheric in nature, and that the story is told in a very subliminal way, in terms of the fact that sometimes the sound and the picture don't match up, which gives you a rather uneasy feeling. And you know, it kind of takes, sometimes the soundtrack will be talking about one part of the story and the visuals will be talking about another part of the story, or two different themes going on simultaneously.
For more enjoyment and greater efficiency, consumption is being standardized.
As George had been working on The Rain People, the film that Francis Coppola wrote and directed, he'd been writing the screenplay of this and was unhappy with the results, and the studio didn't want to give it the go-ahead. In June of 1969, after we had finished the mix on The Rain People, George and I sat down with the ideas and the previous draft of the film and rewrote the story. I think it took us about 4 weeks, and we would take scenes and trade them back and forth, so that I would take a scene and rewrite it or create a new scene and work on this for a day or two, and then give this to George, and he would do vice versa with me. And then at the end of 2 weeks or so, we'd put everything together, read it, and then exchange it back and forth. So the collaboration was a kind of a back and forth collaboration. Although we were in the same room, writing in the same room, we were both writing in longhand and passing sheets back and forth until we completed the script to our satisfaction, handed it in to Warner Brothers. This was to be the first film produced by the American Zoetrope. And we got the green light and started shooting in September of 1969.
That accident over in Red Sector L destroyed another 63 personnel, giving them a total of 242 lost to our 195. Keep up the good work and prevent accidents. This shift is concluded.
Well, in the beginning of the film here, we spend a bit of time trying to develop the environment. People are watching people. It's a society more or less controlled by robots. The other theme that runs through the film is rampant consumerism. Consumerism without purpose, simply to buy things for the sake of buying things.
The only thing that holds people content are a certain amount of drug taking. And consumerism. That was the only other activity that people do is buy things. We called them dendrites. It was that little red object that Robert Duvall bought at the mall. But as soon as you buy something, you simply take it home and you put it in a product disposal device, which vaporizes it and presumably takes the vapors and recongeals them into another red dendrite object. So the only purpose of these objects is to be bought, destroyed, recycled, and bought again.
For those of us growing up in the 60s, this was meant to be a exploration of what it would be like if the other side, the people in control, had their way. Ultimately, the issue here is how does one escape this emotionless environment? And it's told actually in 3 acts, which will become obvious later, and it's the same story told 3 different times, 3 different ways. This is the more conventional way of telling that story in the first act. The second act is a very abstract way of telling the story, and the third act is a very action-oriented way of telling that story, of leaving your environment, leaving an environment that is safe and comfortable and organized and predictable for something that you have no idea, for moving into the unknown. The point is not that he's running towards something, but he's escaping from something. The idea is I wanted to build a rather claustrophobic society where there was no sun and no natural elements at all, no trees, purely mechanical society. We shot all on locations around San Francisco, so all locations are actually real places. It's just that in the way I shot them, the way I excluded things, the framing, the color, the design, I made it feel like an unusual environment.
My mate has been acting very strange. I can't explain it.
This film follows a path into a certain part of the forest that is not overly treaded upon. There are some images in here, for instance, a tape recorder with a lizard, that are simply, you just have to accept them as part of this world and enjoy them for what they are, because there really is not a coherent explanation for why they are in the place that they are.
The lizard in the wires is basically a thematic device. It's a nice image, but it also is what THX is. THX is the lizard in the wires. He's the living thing in the middle of a very static, electronic, computer number-oriented, wiry kind of thing. So it's, again, a symbol to express the larger theme that's going on in the movie. Walter and I would work simultaneously on the film. He would be cutting the soundtrack at the same time I was cutting the picture track. So we would come together. He would work at night, I would work in the morning. We would come together for breakfast and dinner and talk about what we had done during the day. And when he would cut a soundtrack, I would then re-edit the picture to be inspired by a soundtrack and to take advantage of his soundtrack. And then he would look at some of the things I was doing in the editing, and that would inspire him to do certain things, create new sounds or new environments. Because the film was very much meant to be a silent movie. It was meant that the dialogue and the sound effects and the music and the visuals were very stylized, very static, with very, very strong graphic compositions to elicit a kind of bureaucratic emptiness.
THX?
Strange as it may seem, I never talked to George about the origin of those three letters, THX, or of his roommate's name, LUH. I always thought that it had something to do with sex and love, that his name was THX, and her name was LUH, pronounced L, and that because the illegal activity that they were involved in was falling in love with each other and then having sex, that there was an overtone of this embedded in their name. It's certainly true that a number of the people in the prison are named after the philosophical positions that they're taking in prison. There's SRT, who is named after Jean-Paul Sartre, and there's NCH, who is named after Nietzsche, and PTO, who's named after Plato. So the speeches that they all give have philosophical positions taken by those philosophers.
This is a society where sex is with a hologram, it's not with real people. Babies are created in test tubes, where everything has been reduced to its most basic character. Sex without emotion, a world with no anger, a world with no hatred, but a world without love, without any kind of humanity at all.
Although it didn't exist at the time we made the film, the concept here is that there are television channels which have all the same content on each channel, which was definitely not the case in 1969, but it certainly is the case today, where we have the Discovery Channel and the Nature Channel and erotic channels and violence channels, and that's pretty much what the character of THX is doing when he selects a certain channel. Here we have, I guess you'd call it the Rodney King beating channel, where somebody is simply being beaten by one of the robots endlessly.
The issue here is that THX is a reluctant hero. He doesn't really know what's going on. He's being thrust into this unwillingly by his roommate, who has at some point in time experimented with not taking drugs, and as a result fallen in love with her roommate, and then has this unquenchable need to bring him out of his drug-induced stupor so that they can share real emotions together. He eventually will fall in love with her and complicate his life. The heroic act that he takes is that he doesn't go back on drugs. He begins to like the world of emotion and fear and things that he's feeling, and as a result, he can't go back, and that's the main heroic gesture that he makes, which is to say, I'm not going to be part of the status quo here. And that's what happens in this first segment. In the second segment, he's already off drugs, so the big choice, which is the same one, which is I'm going to leave this prison because it has no walls. I can simply, the walls are only in my mind, and I'm going to leave and get out of the status quo of this prison environment. Ultimately, the issue here is how does one escape this emotionless environment? The issue of leaving a safe environment and going out into the unknown is a theme that I then carried on in my next film, American Graffiti, and it's also the same theme that's in Star Wars. It's been a theme that I've always been attracted to, and in this particular film, I really made it the major theme. I must say in the first 3 films I made here, I was very consistent in my thematic obsessions.
Go ahead. What's wrong with me? What am I to her? She to me? Nothing. Yes, fine. She's an ordinary roommate.
The religious aspect of the film is primarily meant as religion as a secular social institution that keeps people in line, that gives them a belief system that allows them to be more docile in a secular environment. And it's the ultimate melding of church and state, which has happened throughout history, but it's really about what happens when you take the belief system and move it completely into the secular system of the way the government is run.
So the music that you hear when you see religious items in the film is Tibetan, Buddhist, and yet the actual image that you see in the confessional is a Renaissance painting of Christ, I think by Lucas Cranach. And when people pray, they pray to Om. So there's some kind of religious supervision or control in the society, but like much of the things in the society, it's kept in a very diffuse state.
The people here are, put on drugs and then controlled through the belief system that there is a higher being, and that higher being has the capacity to give you more units for your job, and as the higher entity is the ultimate boss here. But of course, again, the higher entity doesn't really exist, and that is the unique thing about this particular society, is there is no villain in the piece. The villain is the society itself, but it's not personified other than a picture of a higher being. So as THX's drugs wear off, he becomes less capable of handling his fear and emotion and stress and anxiety. He collapses, and then we have a transition into life with emotion. This is all being watched by another character, SEN, who is calculating to try to get a new roommate, which will ultimately complicate the story. This particular vignette where they fall in love is purposely cut in a very jumpy, disorienting sort of way to give one the sense of what it could be like to be put into this situation of having emotions when you've never had them before. So that you're confused, you're kind of disoriented, it's erotic. It gives you a certain kind of a feeling. It's one of the more dramatically cut sequences in terms of simply Godardian logic, using the medium itself to express the emotions. You know, Walter and I and the whole generation that I came from was very influenced by Godard and Truffaut and Fellini and Kurosawa. Starting out, I started out being mostly concerned with abstract films and with films that were pure cinema, which were only using visuals and sounds to create emotions. And I realized very much that the unique situation I found myself in, being an American zoetrope, being away from the studios, having them approve the film, the studios being confused about what kind of movies work and what kind of movies don't work. I said, this is my one chance to make, you know, a really avant-garde movie in the mainstream. I may never get this again. You know, this is maybe a little open window that's going to close right up again because it's a completely unique opportunity. And so I took it. I mean, it almost brought American Zoetrope down at the end and it almost destroyed my career, but it was definitely worth the attempt at the time.
This was actually one of the first films that I know about to not worry about the problem of the video bars in the frame. Actually, George was interested visually in that because he felt it made it more interesting to look at, that it kind of rubbed the eye in an interesting way. Usually when you shot a film, you spent a certain amount of time arranging the video monitors so that you didn't get those flicker bars. But we didn't have the time nor the money to spend on doing this, and it was actually something that we wanted to take advantage of.
Every once in a while, I have cut to these little vignettes of people reading numbers and things, or robots gone awry that Walter and I thought were hysterical, but I guess the humor is a little dry for the American culture at that point.
We've got a malfunctioning officer in corridor 7A.
All right, just a minute. Stand by, scope 1.
Some beautiful things in the soundtrack, especially with the holograms of really nonsensical dialogue that is very very evocative but completely meaningless. And we worked very hard at creating this kind of doublespeak that talks about all kinds of things, theater of noise and all kinds of stuff that is really quite meaningless, but it seems to give you a very strong emotional hit just by the way it's presented and the use of words more as poetry than any logic that you might put to it. And you'll see that used repeatedly through the movie. Sometimes we just say words, you know, we just put one word after the other that kind of gives you this kind of uncomfortable feeling, or very, you know, soothing feeling that's so soothing that it becomes uncomfortable.
It can't go on forever, you know it can't.
We could leave and live in the superstructure.
This is a scene where, because of the fact that they're off drugs, they have to begin to face the real world, which is now there's an element of danger involved because they may get discovered in their undrugged state, especially THX, that has to do a very, very stressful kind of job, and it's very easy for him to you know, expose himself in terms of his anxiety levels, his breathing, his pulse. That can very easily be detected by the state, and he is, you know, terrified that he's going to become undone.
What's this?
A lot of the extras in the film came from a group whose headquarters was in the San Francisco Bay Area called Synanon, and this had started in Los Angeles as a drug rehabilitation center. It would take people who were addicted to drugs and put them in a social environment and with a work program that was, for a while, extremely successful in getting people off of a drug habit and back into some kind of productive work. We were attracted to them simply because everyone who joined this program had to shave their head. and we needed hundreds of people with shaved heads for some of the larger scenes in the film. And this was a ready and mostly willing supply of shaven-headed people. The ironic thing is that a number of years later, this Synanon society developed into some form of the kind of society that you see in THX. It was eventually disbanded and broken up.
To further complicate the plot, which is in essence extremely simple, I brought in this element of SCN, who is kind of a schemer. He believes in the system. He is not up for drug evasion, but he is up for kind of tweaking the system to his own advantage. He's learned how to make the system work for him. So he's kind of the schemer, but in a very different way than they are. He's simply trying to get a decent, clean roommate. But he's using nefarious means to try to achieve that, which again kind of unwittingly includes THX and LUH, because he works with LUH. In the process of that, he tries to manipulate everything to his advantage. Ultimately, the consequence of that is he is undone, and THX is undone, and LUH is undone.
It was very foolish to pass them up.
Where's LUH?
What?
Your card,
Huh?
please.
When I shot this scene, it was a very a difficult scene to shoot because Bobby Duvall gets it on the first take. Donald Pleasant didn't really get it until like the 10th take. So I'd have a scene where they're both in the same shot, and one of them was great on take 1 and the other one was great on take 10. And that was before we had any kind of digital technology, so I could combine the two takes. It was a real drama sometime to try to get two actors that work completely different ways to hit their best performance at the same time. It was always a challenge. It's the one thing I remember about this scene. Dialogue in the film is intentionally abstract. It tells the story, but it's not told in a consistent, linear fashion. And again, the cutting in uncomfortable situations like this, stressful situations where they're facing love or some kind of strong emotions, are usually cut in a disjointed way. You know, it's very much of a breathless influence. Godard's sort of groundbreaking film from the 60s called Breathless.
We had a long talk, and she agreed that it would be better for both of you to switch. She seemed to think that you weren't accurately mated with her in the first place.
The intimate scene between two people is shot with relatively long lenses against this flat white background, almost like a Japanese screen. George had originally wanted to shoot the film in Japan. He had seen Japanese society as combining these two threads of consumerism on the one hand and social regimentation on the other. And he also was particularly affected by Kurosawa and the films that Kurosawa made and the idea of Japanese graphics.
This is a good example of that nonsense dialogue that is so beautiful to listen to. It's more a song than it is, words.
Is ultimately binary. Stimulating rhetoric. Love. Absolute. The theater of noise is proof of our potential.
When we work with sound in film, we work in three discrete units: the dialogue, music, and sound effects. But conceptually, there really is a smearing of categories so that sometimes a voice can become a sound effect. When somebody yells or screams, there's an ambiguous twilight zone between voice and sound effect. And there is a similar twilight zone between sound effects and music, where something that you perceive of as a sound effect can actually have pretty highly developed musical qualities and be used in the film the way we would use music. The trick is that when people hear something that is overtly music, I don't know, there's a kind of a conceptual hormone that gets released that says, I'm listening to music, and your mind positions itself to understand this. Whereas sound effects are like people who can travel around the world without any passports. Sound effects have a way of sneaking under the radar so that you can be being affected by them in musical ways, emotional ways, but because they seem to be being produced by the visuals, by the world that you're looking at, you tend to accept them at face value and not as something that the filmmakers are doing to create an emotional effect with you, whereas that's not the case with music.
11:38, retract.
So this is a sequence where he tries to put together a droid, which is very dangerous work, without the use of drugs to calm him down and allay his anxiety. And eventually he is discovered through a bureaucratic screw-up. They put a mind lock on him in the middle of a very touchy maneuver, almost causing a disaster. When we shot in this, we actually shot in a real nuclear power plant, and I had about 3 hours to shoot this whole sequence in, or there's like a whole bunch of them. There's like 3 or 4 of these little sequences, but it was very little time. I had hardly any time at all to shoot in that environment, and it was, you know, a radioactive environment, so we couldn't bring very many people in there, and we had to be very careful about what we were doing. It was a clean area, and it was very hard to get the shots I needed, the amount of time I needed, and to make a sequence out of it, you know, that had some drama.
We were interested in a combination of existing technology and extrapolations of existing technology, and just how this would look on screen. The reality of what we were facing was that we had a very small budget to make a film about the future, to create an entirely artificial world for $700,000 was quite a challenge, so that part of the bargain was to accept and go with the existing technology of the day, but to give it a little spin, to use it in slightly different ways. And this goes along with very much George's concept that you can see in this film and also in Star Wars of the used future. He objected, and rightly so, to the fact that in most science fiction films, everything that you see is brand new, whereas at no stage ever in human society is everything brand new. There's always a mixture of the new and the old, and even what looks unfamiliar has been highly used. So part of the art department's responsibility on the film was to make sure that if anything looked new, to abuse it and to paint it so that it looked like it had drips coming out of it, or a patina of dust, or something that would give it the idea that it has been around for quite a while.
One of the central issues that is repeated throughout the movie is this bureaucratic reality of things functioning according to some sort of rule book or set of mysterious laws that defy what is actually happening in a particular scene. So you constantly are seeing the bureaucracy trying to cope with the reality, but never quite getting it right. I mean, they're always sort of missing, or things are slipping through the cracks one way or the other. So it is a society that doesn't quite work. It's very much typified by the droid that bounces into the wall. The whole society basically is that droid that is turning the wrong way. That idea, that theme is repeated throughout the movie over and over and over again in various ways. This particular one about the erroneous mind lock is another example of that. The film was put together editorially with a relatively abstract design of lots of images being flashed at you, images that will repeat themselves later in the movie, that express some of the thematic issues that we were going for, which is people as numbers, people being drugged so that they didn't have emotions, so they couldn't feel love, so they couldn't feel pain, and that everyone was always being watched. There was a very strong social atmosphere, much like you'd find in an anthill, where everybody had their job, where everybody did their job, and nobody really questioned why they were there or what they were doing. It's a society without philosophy. The film has a sense of humor. When the film was made, I think a lot of people were sort of blown away by the bleakness of it. They didn't realize that it was actually a funny movie. but there's a lot of ironic juxtaposition going on, especially with the droids.
George and I both grew up during the McCarthy era. We were both somewhere around 10 when all of that was happening. I think it was our first awareness that there were things wrong with society, that sometimes things could get out of control, certain tendencies. And the phrase, "Are you now or have you ever been?" meaning, in the original sense, a communist or a communist sympathizer, was a catchphrase of the McCarthy era. And that phrase has overtones of a certain kind of state control, where you are, the state is in control and is questioning you about your motives and what your affiliations might have been. So that the phrase crops up in the trial and in various other places in the film.
Everything in here is meant as a metaphor for what life was like in the 60s. The fact that the legal system is full of jargon and procedures and things that no normal human being can understand. Suddenly becoming a guinea pig, it contrasts the arbitrariness of the bureaucracy to the humanness of the victim. One of the biggest issues with the white sequence was the fact that in a motion picture, when a film gets played over and over, it gets scratched a lot and it looks like rain. So we were looking for a way of making a kind of bizarre environment in the white limbo, and Walter came up with the idea of adding this thunder that goes through the whole thing, because he said after the first screening it's all going to look like it's raining in there.
1642, try 612. He seems to have an 818. Can you feel this? 4814. Avoid the 714 and the 2336.
All right.
3334. That's right.
But again, here he's being run around in circles for reasons unknown. But it's the same thing. It's the same theme as when he was in the courtroom. Just a different way of saying that idea that he's nothing more than a lab rat or a little mouse running through a maze. In a maze, he has no idea what's going on. And, any more than the audience knows what's going on. I mean, these guys would come and they're sort of poking him with sticks, electronic sticks and stuff, but you don't know why. So again, it gives you that kind of bizarre, uncomfortable, slightly humorous feeling.
Well, that's enough.
Then there's a medical test, which is kind of the same thing. They probe him and they test him, and he has no idea what's going on. And they even take it to a point where they bring law in to see what would happen if they put them together. It's more of an experiment to see how these people do the vile things that they do, like make love. They're looking at him, and they're looking at this thing called love. He's committed the crime of love, of intense emotion. Intense human emotion, and they can't figure out what it is. It happens, but they don't know why it happens, and they don't. They think that they can do brain scans or blood tests and figure out why he fell in love. So in a way, they're actually even more clueless than he is, because they're looking at this love thing as a very practical kind of thing. I mean, they know they can get rid of it by putting people on drugs. But when they get off the drugs, they're very completely confused about why he's so irrational and why why he would choose to be anxious, why he would choose to have fear, why would he choose to have all these unpleasant emotions. When it's like, why would somebody choose to blind themselves and cut off their ears and break their legs? It just doesn't make sense in this society. because it's, you know, he's done the emotional equivalent of that.
One of my heroes in the early 60s was a social comedian and commentator named Henry Jacobs. And when I was living back in New York, I found a number of records that he had done. And it turned out that he was living in San Francisco. And so George and I contacted him to come over and do an improvisation on the theme of somebody learning how to use some equipment. The idea here is that one of the people whose voices you hear is more experienced and is taking the other person through the steps of how to use this piece of equipment. The only problem for our hero, THX, is that he's connected to the machine so that every button that somebody presses is having a terrible effect on him in his prison cell, which is this white limbo area that has no walls, a prison without any walls.
You get any polarity here on the mobile travel? Look, what? I just punched up 1 and I'm opening.
Imagine that has something to do with the results that 378 was getting.
Like much of the voice work in the film, it was done in improvisatory way. We would describe the conditions to the people who were doing it, and then we'd really just let them go. There was a theater group in San Francisco at the time called The Committee, and we tapped into a lot of their talent, some of whom appear on screen in American Graffiti. They were given, as in any improvisation, they were given their own identity as characters and then just allowed to freely improvise around that. And then we would take these hours of material and edit them down and put them in the appropriate places in the film.
Punch 2 up.
Yes, you can see 2 at once. When you see 3, punch a third and you'll see the numbers grade. Yes, so it's best.
This is one of my favorite sequences. I think it's very, very funny. But again, the humor in the film is so dry, a lot of people are overwhelmed by the oppressive nature of the society. Neither one of us, neither Walter or I, actually felt the film was, you know, oppressive or really deeply disturbing. We thought it was amusing and ironic and a hopeful expression of the power of humanity.
There it is, about 4.6 now, is that right?
Yes, but dissolution occurred at 4.5.
Oh, yeah?
This little reuniting is, again, another experiment to see kind of what's wrong with these people. Sort of the ultimate in voyeurism and contrasted with their, you know, very close emotional reunion, which is very heartfelt and very, you know, loving. You get the sense from the way this is done and the way they come in that, and the sequences that have come before it, that, you know, it's just all being studied. But to them, it's the last time they'll ever see each other. I did huge casting calls on the film, looking for just the right person to play LUH. I need to find some really great actress who could look good with her head shaved and still have a profound sense of humanity about her, that, you know, very vulnerable kind of look and personality, and very sweet. Maggie had never acted before. I mean, she'd done some plays and things, but she never had a big part in a movie. But she, you know, I tested a lot of women, and it ended up that Maggie was the best for it because she was the one that had the most vulnerability and strength, and, you know, she was still extremely attractive with her head shaved. And she did a great job. It was challenging for her in lots of ways because, again, this is a movie where there's not a lot of motion being shown. I mean, in very limited places. And the emotion that is shown is confused emotion of people struggling to try to understand what they're feeling. You know, I didn't want to get into big crying scenes and sort of go over the top with it, so I kept everything reasonably limited about what I allowed them to do. I just wanted it to be on the warmth side. I think she handled it very well. She did a great job.
It seems that in recent years, films generally divide themselves into two categories, either dialogue-driven films where the visuals and the sound play a secondary and supporting role, and action-driven films where the image and the sounds accompanying those images are powerful and overwhelming, and the dialogue is reduced to a supporting role. The film THX is neither one nor the other. It's probably a third stream where the appeal is in the texture and the collision of images and sounds. There's a certain amount of dialogue and a certain amount of action, but the binding force of the film is texture and atmosphere. The question of human relationships in this society is brought under the distorting mirror of this society itself, in that people have been removed from, I guess you'd call it, normal human interaction and any kind of natural settings for so long that under certain circumstances, the SEN, the Donald Pleasance character, has what might be seen as homosexual tendencies, and that he wants to get rid of THX's roommate and he wants THX to room with him. But it's deliberately kept ambiguous. Nothing overt ever takes place, but there is this undercurrent of homosexual crush that Donald Pleasance has on THX. But there's no real clear way that this has any way of acting itself out in this society.
The overtones were meant to actually be asexual. I had Donald Pleasant play it as a very neutral kind of sexuality. No sexuality at all, really. Because the idea was that roommates, they weren't paired by sex one way or the other, because if everybody took their drugs and everybody was neutered in that way and used the mechanical systems with the holograms, that really wasn't an issue.
What's wrong with you? Tell me like that.
It's all right. You're safe now.
Now, this middle section of the movie is the most abstract. Fortunately, the studio never saw dailies on this, because I think if they'd ever seen this scene, they would have fired me on the spot. It was meant to be a more philosophical exercise, abstract philosophical exercise about being put in a prison, finding yourself in a prison, asking philosophical questions. Why am I here? How did I get here? What am I doing here? What is my place in the universe? And then saying, I'm going to walk out of this prison. I'm going to go into the unknown. I'm going to explore the unknown, which is basically what philosophy is. It asks the hard questions of, what are we doing here? And that's basically what THX is going through in this. Finally, he just gets fed up with all the mindless jabber, because there's nothing in here that's being said that's actually makes much sense. I mean, one of the characters actually does nothing but quote Richard Nixon speeches. Sen is the one that has the Richard Nixon speeches. And each character has a philosophical equivalent. There's the consoling guy, the catatonic guy, the sexually aggressive guy, who's aggressive on all fronts. He beats up a droid. And you'll notice also that one of the issues here is that the robots are essentially benign characters. And apart from poking and annoying people, they don't do much. They aren't really a threat. In this sequence, we find out later that you can just knock one over and squash its face in it. They aren't really dangerous at all. But everybody thinks they are. A lot of the reality in this movie is based on belief systems, and the fact that if you believe something to be true, then it is. So if you believe you're in prison, you are. If you believe that's a police officer that's dangerous and strong and can beat you up, then he is. But the reality is just the opposite.
I want ideas. I want one idea. One idea could get us out of here. We just have to be sure that it's the right idea. So we'll find it, we'll know it when we see it. I'll know it when I see it. Here and straightforward and plain as the nose on your face.
I love working with Bobby Duvall on this. It was, these are complicated scenes, and for the most part in this part of the movie, Bobby doesn't have much to do. He mostly sits there angry and catatonic. And for him to create a character with almost no dialogue, this whole white sequence, he hardly says anything except toward the end. And then it's like 1 or 2 words at a time. To try to develop the fact that he's getting more and more disinterested in where he is, and more annoyed with what's going on around him, and more convinced that he's going to go off and make this big decision to leave. It's really all done in pantomime. But that's one of the great qualities of Bobby, is that he's a really good physical actor. He can do mime, he loves to create a character of you. He loves to walk like you walk and, physically become you. He does it as a joke, kind of a mime version of you. He's very good at it. But here, we've told a whole story without dialogue. And the dialogue that is in this scene is total nonsense. That was a real challenge, and Bobby was really game for trying to make it work. But acting-wise, it was a real challenge. Because the reality is, Sen had all of the dialogue, and Sen's dialogue was mostly Richard Nixon speeches. I really enjoyed shooting this. I enjoyed the graphics, of using this big white space with these little sort of orange balls bouncing around in it. And I was very conscious of, again, using what I like to call an open frame, where the camera doesn't hold everybody all the time and people slide off the end of the screen. I've used it in my other films, but this is the place where I've done it the most extreme, because I was in this completely controlled white stylized environment, and I could really slip people and let them bleed, which is something I liked when I was doing documentary films. It's just something that happens because you get in a situation where you can't do anything different. But it gives you this kind of vaguely uncomfortable feeling about the fact something's not quite right, but you don't quite know what it is. I like people sort of going off the frame and coming back, and you don't follow them.
Tomorrow, as we've...
Nondescript 643-1399.
What is it? A shell dweller. They live in the outer shell. Quite unique. There have been 2 here before, and they smell.
This nondescript, as he's described by the policeman character, is brought into prison, and as you hear with his voice, he has a non-human voice. It's actually the recording of a bear. He's one of a society of dwarf people who live at the outer edges of the society, in the shell, which means up near the surface of the earth. And presumably they're closer to the whatever troubles have beset the surface of the earth, and they're looked on as a nuisance by the rest of society.
It's all right. Everything's fine.
Mostly this is about exploring and asking questions, not just settling for the way things are. So everybody here is asking questions, but nobody actually has the guts to leave this place. They just discuss about what it might be, where you might go, how you could get out. There's a lot of talking about things, but no action, which is, again, a double play on philosophy. Is, the intellectual journey is important, but in the end you have to sort of act. And so they're all having the intellectual journey, and he's deciding he's going to be the one that actually just takes off and does it. He's not going to sit and talk about it.
Where are you going? I'm leaving. Leaving what? You can't leave. You can't go. Hey, wait. Oh, I know the smell. Yeah, it's terrible. I have to live with it.
There's a certain amount of organ recycling going on in this society. I guess you'd call it the ultimate consumerism. Later on in the film, you will encounter this more graphically. You see fetuses and various human organs in bottles in a organ recycling center. It was much in advance of what was possible in 1969, but the closer we get, the further on we get in the 21st century, the more apt some of these ideas are becoming. The quest that THX is starting on here as he leaves prison is to find LUH, his roommate whom he's in love with, and to do this impossible thing, which is to escape to the surface, to the exterior, and make some kind of life out there. But he will discover shortly on that she, in fact, has been recycled, along with presumably the child that she's pregnant with, which is the child that THX and she conceived together.
How far before they cancel?
The society is an odd mixture of trends within the communist world at the time. The Cultural Revolution was going on in China, and everyone was dressed in the same black or gray pajama outfit, and encouraged to absolute obedience and anonymity in part of the social machine. And yet, at the same time, we have this highly developed mindless entertainment that's going on in this holographic television, and a similarly mindless consumerism going on where people are encouraged to simply buy more and be happy. So it took both sides of the social equation in 1969, 1970, and merged them together, and then framed them within the context of some kind of ecological or radiological disaster.
The thing I like about this film, I liked at the time, is, especially when I was working on the editing and stuff, is you can't fit it in a box. This doesn't fit in any kind of genre or anything, because it's not really science fiction. It's just a bizarre movie. And again, the tonality between sort of oppressive, dark, deep intellectualism and whimsical silliness is sort of woven through the whole thing. So it's very hard to find out why, which direction you're going. But I don't think they work against each other. I don't think it's like, tonality-wise, I don't think that... sometimes you tell a kind of serious movie and there's humor in it, it doesn't quite fit in. And this, I felt anyway, that we successfully blended the humor with the kind of oppressive nature of the subject matter. This is very much influenced by Beckett and the Theater of the Absurd, which was a very strong influence on the whole idea of the film, which is, we're in a white space, and how do we get out? And there's fear, and there's thing, and they say, oh, you just walk out that door right there. And the idea that there's a hologram who becomes real and comes along and guides him. In this particular case, the hologram is, in mythology, there's always the magical character along the side of the road that they always pick up on the way. And this is sort of my first use of that magical character who isn't real and isn't not real, but is actually smarter than everybody else, but, is kind of, doesn't live in this world, so doesn't quite know how to open the door, but knows, is very wise, but still doesn't, know how to turn on the faucet which way or whatever. So they're not very used to, like, driving a car, but they know how to get you where you want to go. And so it's it's the wise little wizard at the side of the road, which is the hologram in this case, who actually leads him out of the city.
Come on. Here's a doorway.
I'd actually studied anthropology when I was in college. My first 2 years I was actually an anthropology major. Then I switched to cinema in my junior year. I had to read Hero with 1,000 Faces in my second year of anthropology. We did one whole semester was done on mythological things and mythology and all that stuff. But as I say, structurally this was done as sort of Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. Act 2 is the white limbo part. And then Act 3 is them physically escaping, being chased, and and it eventually culminates into the car chase, but it's more of a traditional action piece.
Research into advanced relay system must be given.
I've got a phonic molecular clue on that inner cerebral process that was reported earlier.
How shall the new environment be programmed? It all happened so slowly that most men failed to realize that anything had happened at all.
This scene with the fetuses tells you basically that this is how the people are conceived in this. Some of the people are conceived through sex. THX was conceived through sex. La wasn't. She was conceived in a test tube. And in the readouts and stuff, it explains that. It says, THX birthborn and things like that. So they destroy LUH and they reassign her name to a fetus, which is what he comes across in that control room. Babies in this society are made in test tubes and they're grown in jars. And when somebody dies, they transfer their name to a new fetus. So there becomes a new version. And one assumption is they can clone people. And, it's a completely asexual way of reproducing.
5 on a K8. Transfer all unauthorized contacts in precinct 688, Con G, to this center, mode 7.
Sen's adventure on this, which is intercut with THX's, is that he goes down into the bowels of the earth and gets frightened and then goes back. It's the other side of what THX is doing, which is he gets away and gets down here and just says, this is too creepy and weird and I don't want to be here. So he gets back on the subway and he goes back, waits to get captured, which is what you're supposed to do. He doesn't want to escape. He can't. Where THX is the hero. He's the Buck Rogers. He's the guy that keeps his wits about him and manages to simply walk out. And in this case, he's going to climb up into the brave new world. And that's just as scary for him as Sen looking down in the construction hole, saying, if this is the end of the city, I don't want to have anything to do with it.
This particular location is a circuit room. Probably all of the circuits that you're looking at right now could be packed into the size of a small suitcase. It's one of a number of wonderful incongruities in the film where you're looking at an obviously advanced society, but some of the hardware and the devices that people use are charmingly anachronistic. Telephones with wires coming out of them, ordinary handsets, and this room, which is a television switching room. In fact, when George and I were looking for locations, we went around to Pacific Bell, which is the telephone company in San Francisco, and asked them to show us what was going on and where we could shoot a scene like this. And they did. They were very excited about it because all of this equipment was rapidly becoming obsolete. They were switching over from the dial telephone to the touch-tone unit. And it had not yet been installed, but there were all these computer types standing around very excited about chucking out all of this old relay equipment and entering the new world of the touch-tone telephone, which hadn't yet hit in the late 60s. I remember in particular the fellow who was giving us the tour, we stopped at one circuit and he could tell that this was somebody who was dialing too slowly for his liking, and he reached over and interrupted the circuit, which probably meant that the person who was dialing, the line fell dead and they just got a dial tone, and he found this very amusing. The most particular and peculiar thing about this world is that there is nobody in charge. In that sense, it's like the precursor of the internet, which is a web, a social electronic web, which is so large and diffuse that there doesn't have to be a central brain that controls it. It is self-controlling in a way by virtue of all of the people who participate in it. That was how we saw this particular society, that there There wasn't a big brother who was masterminding all of this and getting some sort of enjoyment out of it. There was simply a bureaucracy in charge, and many of the decisions that were made were bureaucratically driven, but not because of any authoritarian structure.
This little hide-and-seek sequence is designed really to be like the inside of the computer. If anything, this is the all-controlling whatever. This is Ohm, that he's playing hide-and-seek in, like a mouse and a cat and a mouse. You know, totally sterile. I mean, it's not even that he's controlled by a computer. It's just it's not a smart computer. It's not the kind of computers that, you know, you usually find in science fiction, that it's got a mind of its own and everything. This is a computer that doesn't have a mind. It just crunches numbers. You know, it's not like the Matrix in terms of some evil force is back there controlling things. This is a mindless force that's not really effectively controlling anything, except the people sort of go along with it because they believe in it. The world is becoming this way, but it seemed to me at the time it already was this way. You know, it just gets worse. You know, we were living in the 60s, we were living in a surveillance culture, especially in terms of anti-war protests, and the young people at that point were really focused on in lots of different ways that were rather annoying and obnoxious and threatening. You know, for young people especially, there was a fair amount of oppression in terms of being forced to go off to war, not being allowed to protest, being whisked away and put in prison without any charges or anything. Sort of like it is today. Only then they were doing it to college students.
These scenes where we're looking at bodies laid out on slabs, this is a morgue where bodies are preserved and tabbed, where their organs get recycled. This was shot in the Berkeley BART station, the Bay Area Rapid Transit Station, which was being built at the time that we were making this film. We were welcomed into some of the most unlikely kinds of locations. It would be very hard to think about shooting in some of these today. But at that time, the general feeling was much more receptive to be invaded by a movie crew.
Of its primary budget.
Expenditures are 1,000 and rising.
Sen is a believer, and THX isn't. Sen, in theory, is still taking drugs. THX isn't. Sen wants to belong. He doesn't particularly want to rebel. He just wants to make sure that he gets his little extra piece of things and make it work a little bit better. He can't really stand the fact that certain things, you know, don't operate very well. He's just trying to fix it.
See them. Well, they don't know what to do. Sometimes a little adjustment can make all the difference.
But THX is the one that's, you know, contrasting that, somebody wanting to try to be part of the system and make it better, as opposed to somebody who just gives up and says, I've had it, I'm not going to have anything to do with this, I'm going to move on and find a new world. Which are the two juxtapositions of how people approach things like this. I mean, approach a situation that doesn't work. One tries to fix it, the other says, I'm going to start all over again.
Because this film was as experimental as it was, although it was made under the logo of Warner Brothers, it was a highly experimental film. And it was made by an independent company, American Zoetrope, and it was made by young people. George was 24 and I was 25 at the time that we made the film. I think its antenna were more receptive to certain things that were going on at the time, certain anxieties that we had, and certain criticisms that we had of the world that we were living in. It certainly wasn't an officially sanctioned film in any sense of the word. I was delighted but slightly amazed that we actually got the green light to go ahead with this project. When the studio saw the film, they were dismayed at it and felt that this was not the script that they had approved. I don't know what script they were reading or what they were reading into the script that they got. probably because of its experimental nature and the fact that it had so little input from the large corporation that was financing it. It probably, like a litmus test, it probably picked up things in the environment to a greater degree than the other films that Warner Brothers was making at the time.
This definitely was of a time when there was a lot more liberal thinking in Hollywood, in the studios. Now these kinds of films are made outside of Hollywood. You got to remember, in those days, really up until Star Wars, there was no independent American films made that made, say $1 million. It just didn't happen. Not that this film made $1 million. It's only in the last 15 years that we have a really robust independent film industry that has distributors, and you can have access to money, and you have access to theaters, and you can make really off-the-wall kinds of movies. There's a marketplace for them. But back in those days, there really wasn't, and this was the film industry itself toying with the idea of doing these kind of movies. They didn't have sort of classic film divisions or independent film divisions or anything. They thought of this film as, they wanted it to be something like Bonnie and Clyde, which they didn't believe in either. Of the films they had that they didn't believe in, that one actually went on to be successful in spite of their efforts to dump it into the ground, and this one didn't. This didn't survive that kind of neglect. I felt protected by Francis when I did this film. We were in San Francisco. The studio didn't look at anything I was doing, so I felt fairly safe, and I had made the decision to make a reasonably abstract film in the Hollywood theatrical marketplace, because I really had no interest in going into theatrical films. I wanted to do abstract films. That was my goal, so I said, well, I have to make it a little bit accessible, but I'm still going to do what I want to do, because I think this is the only opportunity I'll ever get to do that. And if this ends my career as a theatrical film director, so what? I'll go back to being a documentary filmmaker, and I'll do avant-garde films on the side. And that was sort of what I thought was going to happen. And so I said, well, gee, I get this shot, I'll take it. So I felt fairly secure about it, and I felt that we were getting to pull something over on somebody that, I wasn't surprised at the reaction the studio had when they finally saw it. I mean, I wasn't very happy about the fact that they wanted to change it, because I thought that was a useless gesture, but, I certainly wasn't surprised about it, and I was always amazed every day that I was getting away with it. I was getting as far as I was, that they weren't coming and stopping me for some reason. Because all they had to do was look at it, and they'd know that this was not your conventional movie. Or look at dailies. They could have, amazing enough, I think, they should have read the script and said, this is not a conventional movie. But I think that's the power of Francis, being able to talk somebody into something that is one thing and they believe it's another.
What is that? Induce?
The amazing thing about putting a film together is that it involves hundreds of people, all of them argumentative, creative types, working closely together over an intense period of time, and somehow after, in quotes, only a year, you have a finished product. Anyone who's ever dared to remodel their house knows that you're very lucky if you can get 4 carpenters and electricians and plumbers to all come in on schedule and on budget. But filmmaking, somehow mysteriously, we all get together and produce something that has never been made before. Any film that is worth making is a one-off, and they generally come in pretty close to budget and pretty much on time. And I think it has to do with the amount that people follow their own intuition and are somehow intuitively tied into the intuition of others. The fact is that if you had to actually articulate all of the decisions that get made on a film, if everything had to be written out, let's do this, and then you do this, and then you do this, every acting decision, every decision in cinematography, every decision of production design, every editorial decision, if all of those had to be overtly articulated, the film would never get done. At the very heart of the filmmaking process is a reliance by everyone involved, particularly the heads of departments, on a gut feeling about what might be right. And it's delegated to the director to supervise and choreograph all of these various decisions, some of which the director is making, but many of which are being presented to the director So the director, in that sense, is kind of like the immune system of the film, somebody who is allowing certain things to enter the body of the film and is preventing certain other things because they'd be poisonous to the organizing principle of the film.
Once we start getting into the cars, then we get into the real chase part. I had to create a situation having absolutely nothing to work with, and I'm a big racing fan, and I had knew a lot of people that raced cars and stuff. I was able to acquire a couple of race cars and redress them as regular cars, and have a chase scene, which is something that's near and dear to my heart. The idea here again is an extension of the fact that the hologram is the wise little magician on the road who can guide THX to escape. But when it comes to technology and learning how to operate in the world of technology in the real world, because he doesn't live in the real world, he's not able to do that. And so when he gets in the car, he can't use technology because he's the antithesis of technology. Even though he is at the same time the most technological character in the movie, he's also the one that can't cope with the technology. And the point with THX stopping and looking back and everything is that he has feelings for the hologram. The characters that are the most human are the ones that are the least human.
Changeable, alterable, mutable, variable.
THX is a film that was made absolutely outside of the usual methodology by which films are made today, where you preview a film and then you have consensus groups and many producers who all see the film and weigh in with their opinion about it, and then the studio and marketing. None of these things existed at that time in anywhere near the sophistication that they exist today. And we were also working independently outside of this system in San Francisco to begin with. And there was a general feeling in the film industry at the time that the old ways of doing things weren't working. And so people like ourselves were given, relatively speaking, a great deal of freedom to make the film the way we thought it and to either be a success or hang ourselves in the process.
The idea of this car chase was to do a car chase that wasn't a traditional action set piece, but to do a car chase that was a little bit more just using a car. Because in the end, the people that are chasing are never in the same shot. You know, normally in a car chase, you put the people right next to each other and they're running along and they're bouncing around and they're doing all this stuff, doing stunts and they're running into things and all kinds of stuff. But this was simply a chase where the two people that are chasing are never in the same shot together. And there's nothing really impeding anybody, except at the very end when they stop, when they crash. But, there's no near misses and no, it's all created through a kind of, benignness. It's like everything else in the movie, which is it's done in separation and it's done in a much more subtle way than you would ever try to do an action set piece. You know what I mean? He's being chased, but he's not actually being chased. And his opponent in this is mainly technology. The robots that are following are technological, but it really has to do with him in the car and whether the car is going to work or not. You never see him and the robots together, except at the very end when everybody crashes. It's a very subtle kind of chase. This was post-Bullet, where a chase was really a chase and people went over hills and they crashed into things. And I decided to do a chase that wasn't like that. And I had to shoot it in tunnels. So we used every tunnel, and we had to have a lot of different tunnels, so we used every tunnel in the San Francisco Bay Area, and we'd close off these tunnels at night and race through them, and the neighbors would all complain because these were actual race cars and they had no mufflers or anything. They were very, very loud, and we'd shoot at night because the only way we could close off these tunnels. And so you have these tunnels acted like a amplifier. So you'd have these huge race car sounds coming up at 2 or 3 in the morning. And all the neighbors would call the cops. What's going on? And a couple times we actually got shut down. But we were fortunate that they were just starting to build the Bay Area Rapid Transit System, which is a subway system. And nothing was finished yet, so we were able to use their computer centers, which is where this large room is, and the tunnels and the empty stations of one form or another. Gave us actually quite a few sets using the BART system. And it's always a challenge making a film, because you're always working against the fact that you have limited resources to tell your story. So you have to try to use your imagination as much to get the story told with no resources as you do to sort of use your imagination to tell the story itself. But that's a reality of filmmaking, and no matter how much money you have, you're still facing the fact that you have to figure ways to get the story told that you can actually manage with your resources, as much as it is, you know, how cinematically and how story-wise and dialogue-wise you actually tell the story.
I have an ambiguous relationship to sound effects libraries. I recognize that they're very important things, and I do rely on them. At the same time, if I was allowed all the time in the world, I would try to record everything myself, because libraries are sounds that have been effective in other films, but that doesn't mean that they would be effective in this particular film. It's something that I guess is akin to cooking. The best thing is to use fresh ingredients, and the very best thing is to use ingredients that you have grown or hunted yourself. That's my policy with sound effects. It's a completely impractical policy, so I have to use, let's say, canned goods or freeze-dried goods, but as a general rule, I try, wherever possible, to get newly recorded things.
Expenditures are $14,000.
You have just exceeded your primary budget.
This was, doing a chase with very little to work with, so trying to get it to end was a real challenge, because it was hard to do the stunts in the tunnels and find something that they could trip over. And so finally we had the scaffolding at the end, and we had a young stuntman named Duffy Hamilton who was, one of his first films, and he was very excited about doing the picture and wanted to do an absolutely great job. So he ended up going a little bit faster than he should have to do the stunt with a motorcycle, and he overshot his mark and ended up staying with the motorcycle and went crashing into the wall. And boy, I'll tell you, we all thought he was dead.
And they rushed in to try to save him. In fact, he was perfectly fine, amazingly enough. He didn't get hurt. But he was furious with everyone, because he said the first law of stunt activity is that you count to 10 and then run in. Because if by mischance there is a fatality, the stuntman would want that used in the film, because otherwise the whole exercise was pointless. As it turned out, George was able to use the shot because the people just cleared the frame. That there was an edit point available. Had somebody been 3 or 4 frames earlier, we wouldn't have been able to use it.
He wasn't supposed to do that. He was supposed to land about halfway down and then skid the rest of the way and not even hit the car. But he went a little faster than he should have gone, because he wanted to make it that much better. And he didn't have, all the experience to say, don't try to show off when you're doing a stunt. So that was probably the most exciting moment in shooting the film, I'll tell you. For me, being my first movie and everything, and not having a lot of experience with stunts and everything, I was really terrified that he'd been hurt. And then we get to kind of the final level. I wanted to give the sense that he was going up levels and going through environments, and so we get to the top level, which is full of shell dwellers, which we saw introduced one back in the White Limbo. and the shell dwellers and their creatures that live with them, and all the kind of nastiness that is starting to come in. It's not as clean up here, it's not as nice, and it's there are weird people live up here and all that kind of stuff. Once we get to this level, it was to just make it kind of creepy, a different kind of environment than anything we've seen before.
What you're looking at now are the Bay Area rapid transit tunnels before any tracks had been laid, and they've been photographed in a way to make it appear vertical, which meant that Robert Duvall and the policeman following him, although they're horizontal, they have to mime their actions as if they're working vertically.
He was actually just crawling along the floor of a BART tunnel.
The thing that really makes it work, I think, is that there are a number of angles where the camera is flipped upside down so that you're looking at an inverted image. This disorients you so that it makes it appear vertical.
One of the final statements of the movie is that you're dealing with a social system where everything's on budget, that money kind of rules everything, and I guess it was a bit of a statement, my feelings about the studios at the time.
Although it's never specified in the film, it's assumed that something has gone wrong and that the surface of the Earth is no longer habitable. At the very end of the film, when THX emerges out of the tunnel up to the surface and he sees the sun for the first time, there's a bird that flies past. George and I talked about whether we should include that or not, because it does indicate that there is some form of life out there. And in the end, as a meager but significant sign of hope, we decided to use that particular shot because it at least gives THX a chance of being able to survive on the surface.
This was a shot that was done after the movie. We tried to get the shot a couple times, and finally I sent my friend Caleb Deschanel out, and took a week and went out and sat on the beach and waited for the sunsets to get the right sunset to put here, because I'd shot one before on my student film, and I wanted to get one like that, and we discovered it wasn't as easy to get as it was the first time.
It was shot with a 1,000mm lens, which was one of Zoetrope's prized possessions, a huge chunk of metal and glass which was 4 feet long, and the human figure that you see emerging up out of the ground and standing there in silhouette is not Robert Duvall, as it was intended to be, but is Matthew Robbins, the director and writer who wrote the original sketch on which THX was based.
Fortunately, I've never made a film I don't like to watch, and I enjoy this film. I had a great time making it. It was really my sensibility at the time. It's still a lot of my sensibility. I've just gone off on this strange path that is not at all like where I thought I was going to be. This is really the kind of filmmaking I started doing, and probably the filmmaking I'm going to go back to someday. It's a much more interesting style of filmmaking than I'm currently find myself in. I mean, I enjoy doing the more traditional, Hollywood style movies, and I started doing them just to see if I could do it. But these more sort of slightly offbeat movies is really where my cinematic heart is.